Started and appreciate everyone's attendance today, and appreciate the interest in this topic, which is an important topic for our state. The secretary is passing around a slide deck to the members. It's entitled Joint School Funding Legislative Commission Meeting, Tuesday, November 12th. What I'd like to do is run through a couple of these slides, and Chairman Garrett's going to take a couple slides in a minute, and then we'll get started with our presentation for the day. So if you turn the first page of that slide deck where it has meeting objectives, we want to revisit the challenges of our current system, the foundation program, and how a student-weighted formula could address those challenges. And we want to show today 3 models of what it could look like and allow you all as commission members to go talk to others, do whatever you'd like to do, your hometown superintendents and areas in your district, to just look at these models, kick the tires, see what you think, see what they think, get feedback from whomever you would like to get feedback. But this is just a starting point to kind of show members of the commission what a particular funding model might look like. Again, we're not beholden to any of these. For our agenda today, we want to talk about, the challenges with the current formula, and we've talked, just as a refresher, how we would address these challenges and with a student-weighted formula, and we'll have Jen here from Bellwether to talk about that. Next, we'll talk about can Alabama afford to transition? How are we going to fund it or make it happen? Mr. Fulford will discuss that. Then we'll talk about the models, the 3 potential models, again, starting points, points of discussion, not beholden to any or all of them. Of course, we just could choose one. And that'll be Alex from Bellwether, and then lastly, talking about the accountability component, that if we enhance the student funding for various school districts, what accountability measures could be brought to bear. The overview of the process today. Again, we said it before, we'll say it again, no decisions have been made. They're just, these models are a starting point for discussion based on the feedback that we've heard as far as the prioritization. Then we're going to learn more about what's possible as we look at these models, and then we need you all to help us think through the decision-making process. So the challenges of the current system that we've discussed before, our system is the foundation formula. We've had it over 30 years. Most other states, as you've heard us say, we're one of 5 that are left with a true foundation program. The rest of the country has moved to a student-weighted formula type program, funding program, and that's the reason Chairman Garrett and myself thought it would be important for us to visit that discussion with those on the Ways and Means and F&TE committees. So these committees could see what else is going on in the country, and then how it might look in Alabama, and make a decision as to whether we want to follow the other states, or we want to continue upon the path that we are on, or maybe do a hybrid. And I don't throw that out as a suggestion, but just as a possibility. The current formula doesn't address student need. In other words, it just gives funding based on head count, more or less. The research shows that students have a greater educational need. Those that have greater educational needs, our English language, our students with disabilities, poverty, etc., require more support to meet their academic goals and require a greater investment of our taxpayer dollars. Moving on, our current school funding formula creates challenges for the school districts in that you can say that it's under-resourced because it lags behind most states. The other peer states have acted to address these shortcomings, as we said. It's inefficient. The foundation program and at-risk funding do not effectively target funding to meet the student needs. Right now, the foundation program, as we said, is based on headcount. Doesn't matter if the student's a poverty student or an English language learner or a special ed student or a gifted student, they all are weighted the same. Now, we do have some pots, I'll call them, of money in the budget for each of these categories. And if you take the largest pot, that's our poverty appropriation, our at-risk, as we call it, appropriation, that's the equivalent of less than 1% of the overall picture for those poverty students. Next, the foundation program that we have is a bit inflexible in that it limits the ability of the local leadership, the local school boards and superintendent, to direct funding as they see fit. In raw dollars, you see that we have increased funding from 2007 and 8 to 21-22. You see it goes up a little over $1,000 there. But after adjusting for inflation, you do see, and you've seen this slide before, that you see that it's actually decreased in this time period of $860 a student. In other words, we have not kept up with inflation as far as our funding for students. And at this time, I'm going to flip it over to Chairman Garrett, who will carry us through the next couple slides before we hear from Bellwether.
Thank you, Chairman Orr. So now as you look at the slide we have before us here, is Alabama's school funding system directs relatively little funding to support student needs. You can see that graph, that color that's gray or blue, whatever that color is, that's the foundation program. Above that is a very slight sliver. That's 1.2% of the budget. And that is what we do to address student needs apart from the foundation program. So that's the problem we have, is that our formula does not take into account student needs. Now, the next slide, and we'll get more into the details here, but if you did a scatter diagram plot of how we fund education today, that's what it looks like. It's a flat line. You'll see some very, very minute above and below, but typically that's a flat line, which basically says our system is based upon an equity funding method, and that's what you get. Everybody gets the same amount, regardless of their need. When you look at what we would do with the student formula, we would basically weight systems based on student need. We would develop a base that everyone would get, and then we would develop weights on specific needs that would increase what those systems would get. Now, our policy goal, as we said repeatedly, is that if we decide to move forward, we want, number one, that the funding would better meet the needs of the students, and I'll show you in a minute some charts that will illustrate that. We want all districts to see an increase in per pupil funding. So we want all systems to see increase, no one to take a decrease, everyone see an increase. We want systems to receive more flexibility. When I was at a meeting this weekend, I had a colleague ask me about it from a question from their system superintendent about having some money that is earmarked that they really don't need it for that purpose. And that's the problem, is every system is different. Right now we do equity funding, everybody's treated the same. This would allow more flexibility within those systems to spend as they would like. But the fourth point that's very, very important is nothing we're talking about today will impact local funding. Local money is not brought into the formula. We're talking strictly about the state piece, so that's very important. if you look at, again, we're going to look at some 3 models, and these are just models that we will continue to tweak. We expect to get feedback from the education community, from other people, from our colleagues from here in our committees as well. But if you were to take, for example, one of the models, which is the model that would have the least increased funding, you can see that green. You see the flat line you saw before, where systems all got the same. You see a slight trajectory up, and you see below that ghost circles. That's kind of where we are today. So what you see is that these systems would get more money, and it would be in a not a flat line, but kind of an increasing line based upon their needs. That's one model. Another model, we could add a little more money to the formula, and you can see here there's a separation from those ghost shadows to what the new picture would look like, and you can also see that same trajectory. So the point is, the more we kick in here, the more we separate from this flat line where we are today, but also you see the increasing based upon needs. And then finally, we've got a model that would show if we increase the funding, and this Model 3 is going to be basically $200 million, that's what that would do. So a $200 million increase into what we're talking about would have a significant separation from where we are today, and you would continue to see that student needs based in a better way. And then finally, here's what those 3 would look like. So again, the ghost shadows where we are today, what would happen with these illustrative models we're going to talk about today. But that's what I want you to see visually where we're going. You're going to see a lot of details and numbers, but what we're trying to do is get to a point that systems receive money and students receive money based upon their needs, and there is some separation. But again, no local money is affected, and everybody will get more. Okay. With that, I think we're ready to turn it over to whom? Jim. Jen, welcome.
Good morning. I'm Jen Sheese with Bellwether. Excited to be with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that I talked about with you when I was here with you in August in this first section, and then we'll go into models a little bit later. We can move to the next slide, please. Or I have, no, I don't.
Here, do you want this? Let's
Throw it to me. So first, to just ground a little bit in research, sort of, does money matter? We talked about this a little bit before, but over the past 10 or 15 years, we've had an increasing research base that does validate that increased spending in public schools does translate to better outcomes for students. This just summarizes a few exemplar studies. The links are in the slides as well. We'd be happy to provide the links to the original studies here, but what we typically see is that an investment of at least $1,000 per student does drive changes in outcomes, positive changes in outcomes, particularly for low-income students. So that's kind of the rationale behind thinking through, in general, an investment in public education funding and increased funding, and in addition, a rationale for really driving those funds towards student needs. That's where you get the biggest bang for your buck based on the research space currently.
Let me just make a comment too. I have to go back to my statistics from college, which is I'm very rusty on right now. But that first point says after 10 years, the NAEP scores in low-income districts improved by 0.1 standard deviation. But that 0.1 deviation was roughly the equivalent of 72 additional days of learning. So as we kind of talk about that.
Yes. So, you see some very small numbers. Again, this is very statistically based, but if we translate that standard deviation increase in test scores, what we are translating to is additional days of learning. And what that particular study shows is that the impact of the increased investment is not just significant in statistical terms, it's durable over time. And so what you're seeing is that you're getting dividends from that investment over a period of time of the investment. And I think one of the things that's important to know about these 3 studies in particular is that they are specifically studying the kind of thing that you all are contemplating today. a major sort of school finance overhaul in the state's primary school finance formula, not an investment in a particular program or a line item, but this kind of revision and investment in sort of that very foundational base funding that goes to fund all public education services. I do want to ground a little bit in the perspective that I bring to this work. I lead the policy and evaluation team at Bellwether, and as part of that work, lead a school finance initiative. We've been doing this work for several years, and by way of background, I worked for the Texas legislature for a long time in a nonpartisan role supporting the development and implementation of that state's public education budget. So I've been in and around school budgets at the state level for a long time. And our team kind of anchors on these 4 principles. These are our principles. They don't have to be your principles, but I want you to understand the perspective that I bring as I share information with you today. So we think about adequacy. Is there enough funding in the system to enable the state to meet its constitutional mandate for public education? We think about student need. Does the policy allocate greater resources towards student needs that are supported by research? So the kinds of things we've been talking about and that the chairman laid out earlier. Low income, students with disabilities, English language learners, those types of things that the research base tells us are important to think about as we think about resourcing our schools. Responsibility. Does the policy make clear where decision making happens? We talked a little bit, Chairman Orr talked a little bit about that flexibility issue. Are we making spending decisions close to students where folks know what those particular needs are and can make strategic resourcing decisions at the local level to determine how to use those dollars? But the state is directing those dollars towards its policy goals and its goals for student outcomes. And then transparency. Are these policies clear and understandable? Are they only as complicated as they need to be, as kind of the way we try to think about it? Education is a complicated endeavor, and there's a certain amount of complexity that's required in these systems in order to target that funding towards student need. But we want to see that minimized so that the policy is clear, it's understandable, and you can trace the dollar to the policy goal. And that leads us to student-weighted funding formulas. So there are essentially 3 types of funding formulas that states use. Student-weighted funding formulas are by far the most common. Resource-based formulas, which is what Alabama has now, along with a handful of other states, is the second type. And then very rare, I think only Wisconsin has a program-based formula, although many states have program-based elements in their formulas.
And when you say student-weighted is the most common, what, 45 states use student-weighted formula?
Probably. I'd have to look at the map. They change. Mississippi, for example, just transitioned from a resource-based to a student-weighted funding formula, but 45 sounds right to me.
Right.
So when we look at these 3 formula types against the criteria that I just laid out for you, we find that student-weighted funding formulas perform the best according to all 3, in part because on the adequacy front, they're relatively easy to adjust. We'll talk about the structure of these formulas, but essentially you adjust the base number, you've adjusted the entire formula. So you can kind of keep track of how the amount of funding that is being delivered to schools is indexing to cost that way. With student need, which is what I really want to highlight here, student-weighted funding formulas are the easiest, most transparent way to really target funds towards student needs because that's what they're designed to do. Sort of their form follows their function in that case. Responsibility, again, back to that flexibility point with a student-weighted funding formula, it's not dictating how districts spend their money, it's providing that level of resources based on student need and then enabling local districts to make those strategic decisions. And then transparency. Relative to the other 2 types, student-weighted funding formulas are pretty easy to explain, and they're relatively simple in their structure. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that structure now before we get into models. So this is a very simple example of how a student-weighted funding formula works. You start with a base amount. That is the same amount, essentially, that is delivered for every student based on enrollment. And then you add to that weights based on student characteristics. So what you see here is a weight for economic disadvantage. So within that student population, you determine how many students meet the criteria for economic disadvantage. You provide some additional funding for that enrollment. Same with English language learners. You add all that together and you get the student-weighted funding formula amount. So relatively simple structurally. It gets more complicated when we get into the details, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's essentially how they work.
And another another category would be special needs, which we would add to that.
That's right. This is just a kind of a heuristic, not a recommendation.
Right.
So essentially, if you all decide to move forward with a student-weighted funding formula, there's 3 categories of decisions that you'll need to make. One is around the base amount. So what is that amount that is delivered for every student regardless of their specific learning needs? The second category is those essential weights for student needs. So which student needs are you targeting funding towards? The most common are low income, students with disabilities, English language learners. Other categories include gifted, and there's a variety of choices you can make there. And then kind of at the top of what is a pyramid, but the borders disappeared there, are other weights. So you may consider other characteristics like community characteristics like concentrated poverty or sparsity. A lot of states do that as well. You can consider career and technical education, just sort of other things that you may want to incentivize in your sort of overall policy goals in that very last category. So those are the decisions that will be before you after you make that kind of threshold decision if you want to move forward with this process.
So before we go forward with Mr. Fulford's presentation, does anybody have any questions? Because I think it's important we understand kind of where we are and what the goal here is. Does everybody clear on what we're trying to at least discuss? Yes, sir, Representative Lover.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's not necessarily a question, it's concern. That I look at, we certainly want to lift all the state of Alabama, but as we move through this process, the back one slide, where the economic disadvantage weight, just through that discussion, just as we go through it, how some of that is measured, and we want to look at the whole state to help, but we all have districts. For my district, I'm fortunate to be in an area that's a very affluent school system, but I have to work 5 jobs to live there myself. So it's just where the cost of living and just so how that weighted measured is, from my perspective, we'll be looking a lot to try to see how those questions are answered.
It's a really important question, kind of how it's determined who's eligible for these weights. We'll certainly talk through that.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In these areas where the need will be determined, that we would have to increase funding because of the factors of which ultimately this body will decide that we'll consider. Is there any consideration in the efforts to advance these students about the conditions that these students are trying to learn in and those being addressed? I just give you one simple one. We have schools that have beautiful laboratories, labs, what I'm saying, science labs. Then we got some schools that had to get the little lab kit. You see what I mean? In a little box, and then they've got to learn at the same level. I just use that, even though we're talking about reading and a lot of basic things in here. Is there a factor in that? Because, these members have heard me say this numerous times, and that's simply this. We have systems with holes, and then we have systems that are baseline. If we are going to take the same approach, as we said, that for everybody in the state to accomplish a certain goal, then we've got to fill the hole, as well. What we talking about is from whatever baseline point, and not bothering, local monies, and then moving to reach these targets and these goals. But if someone is in a hole, they're below the baseline. So the baseline is, in terms of accomplishment and advancement, it's going to be very difficult because they got to come out the hole. So is there a factor in these kind of formulas or in any of these approaches that's going to be able to address that need?
Let me address it in a couple of ways. One is just to clarify that we are not talking about facilities funding, capital funding in this conversation. This is operating funding. So to the extent that some of the things you're talking about lab construction, those kinds of things fall into that capital bucket, that's not part of this conversation. What I would just lift up beyond that is the commitment that the chairs have gone over in terms of policy goals, which is that every district gains. And by keying a formula towards student need, that's also going to key formulas towards community need as well. But will be for this body to decide, what's the right level of investment and how do you determine how those dollars are allocated.
Representative Faulkner.
Jennifer, thank you for being here today and for this presentation. Question is, is the goal that we're trying to keep the base amount that we are currently giving per pupil, that at least that remains the same and grows as it has over the last number of years, so that no one loses on the base amount going forward. And none of our school districts will lose. Is that the goal? Is that bottom part of the triangle, or the first part in that slide?
That's really not a goal. That's a requirement. And I think that you'll see when we get into the numbers, the base number will be adjusted, and we'll talk, because there's things right now that that 1.2% that we're specifically earmarking for things. Some of that may come into the base, so hold off on that. But the answer is yes. It's not really a goal. It's a requirement that the base be that no one lose.
Gotcha.
And yeah, that would be adjusted. All right, I don't want to bog down here, but I just want to make sure everybody understands kind of what the picture of what we're trying to do, because some of this stuff can kind of dry. Any other questions about where we're trying to go? All right, thank you. Kirk, you ready?
Yes, I think my purpose here today is to try to tell you that whatever you decide to do, you can afford to do it. And again, the decision is entirely up to you. What I want to show you is what actually happened with this year's budget. The answer to the first part of the question is, as long as you continue to receive more than you're spending, you've got excess money to be able to do a lot of things. This is actually what happened with the 2024 budget that ended in September. Focus on the third blue, I think it's a shade of blue. The ending balance before reversion is $1.86 billion. The provisions of the Rolling Reserve Act take care of the majority of that money. $113 million will go to the Budget Stabilization Fund, another $874 million roughly to the Advancement and Technology Fund. And Senator, to your question regarding capital, Senator Smitherman, to your question regarding capital funds, that money can be used for capital. That's one of the allowed uses there, and there may be a supplemental appropriation coming to spend a portion of that money. And then another $349 million into the Educational Opportunities Reserve Fund. So after these transfers get made, the bottom part of that says the balance in the Budget Stabilization Fund, again, that money can only be accessed in the event of proration, so it's really locked up. And the Advancement and Technology Fund will have over $1.6 billion. You have the authority to spend some or all of that money in a supplemental appropriation bill. And then the new reserve fund, the Educational Opportunities Reserve Fund, which you just established a couple of years ago, will have over $1 billion in it. One of the allowable uses of that money is for transformative changes in education. So if you decided to pursue something like this, and if it increased required obligations by a certain amount of money, that money is available that you could use to help you transition over a period of time, if that's what you decided you wanted to do. But it is there for that purpose. So the other part of that, I want to make clear that you understand, the Rolling Reserve Act gives you increased spending authority every year. That doesn't mean you have to appropriate to the allowed spending authority, but this is what the Rolling Reserve Act would allow you to spend through 2030. It's basically a 5.75% increase beginning in 27 and thereafter. In 2026, the budget you'll be working on when you come in February, it will provide additional spending in ETF over the previous year of over $560 million. Now, if you keep the split the same as it has been in 25, the amount of that would go towards K-12 is over $381 million, almost $382 million. Now, I know there's been much discussion about PHIB and TRS and how that's going to impact those numbers. Well, let's throw that out there. So the PHIB increase going from $800 to $904 will increase obligations in 2026 by roughly $129 million. Now, only 72% of that is paid from ETF appropriations. Those are ETF appropriations to the entities receiving ETF funds. So roughly $93 million of that, if you decided to honor that request would come from ETF appropriations. Similarly, on the TRS side, because of some recent changes that you made, you'll have to increase costs there of roughly, now I have to put my glasses on, of roughly $84 million. Again, only a portion of that is ETF related, and then only a portion of that is K-12 related. So there's numbers being tossed about, but it doesn't really get down to the real issue. That there's the overall number for TRS is roughly $85 million. The overall number for PHIP is roughly $93 million. So 170, but only roughly 2/3 of that would be related to K-12. So that only would, if you honored both of those requests, would only eat up a portion of the K-12 available money in 26. Again, going forward, you get to over $400 million in increases year over year available to use for K-12 purposes. That's important to note. I think to Representative Faulkner's point, is the base going to continue to grow? Again, that's entirely up to you as far as what you want to do, but that growth would allow the base to continue to grow if that's what you wanted to do, and eventually pay for it out of your increased allowable expenditures year over year, as opposed to transitioning from another fund to cover the cost. This is a summary of Kirk's spreadsheet that I've got that you don't even want to see. It goes on for pages and pages, and too big to fit on this. So this is the 3-column version of what I'm telling you, in that this is what we expect in revenues over expenditures, and that expenditures includes beginning balances and reversions reappropriated. And why I have to put that in there is because the provisions of the Rolling Reserve Act require me to capture that in order to figure out what the overflow and the waterfall winds up being and what the transfers out are going to be. In other words, what I'm telling you, absent a big drop off in revenues, which are not anticipated at the time, and even if you factor in the additional reduction of the 1% on food, you still wind up with excess revenue every year through 2030. In 2030, it only gets down to roughly $500 million. So there's obviously going to be some leftover money. There's obviously going to continue to be money flowing into these reserve funds.
That's the balance in the ETF, but in addition to that, you have budget stabilization, opportunity fund,
yes,
and A&T.
That's right. So the projected ending balance in over to the far right hand is what winds up flowing into those other funds. In other words, this is not a reserve fund for the ETF. Most of that money on the right-hand side gets filtered into the Budget Stabilization, Advancement in Technology, and the Educational Opportunities Reserve Fund, with only a small portion remaining left over for ETF supplemental appropriation. But again, the point being, there's still excess revenues all the way through 2030, absent some major changes. I know there was an article about October receipts, and the sky's falling. Don't read too much into 1 month's worth of receipts on the education budget. Please don't. If there's a problem, I'll be the first to let you know. But 1 month is too quick to point and to figure out the sky's falling. It's not happening yet. I'll let you know when it starts happening, and we get concerned again. The issue on the budget is the difference between receipts and expenditures. As long as your expenditures are down here, and when revenues are up here, even if they drop off, you still got a big cushion between the two. That's the only problem you have with revenue slowing up, revenue declining. And by the way, that new reserve fund can also be used to transfer money into the education budget in the event there is a situation where revenues decline to the point of not being able to support continuing to fund the obligations. One thing I wanted to mention, and probably a little premature in terms of what you could do, and again, if you decided to pursue a student-weighted model, there are several things that have been discussed that are currently funded in the budget that you might want to transition into the new model and discontinue what you're currently doing. High need special educational grant program, if you decided to do a special education component of a student weighted model with additional funding, that wouldn't necessarily be needed. There's several different pots for at-risk. Again, if you decided to do the at-risk component of the model with the weighted formula, then you wouldn't necessarily need to continue to do those things as well. English language learning and gifting. So altogether, if you decided to use any of those as a component in your model going forward, it would free up roughly $100 million that you're currently spending in the ETF budget that you might be able to use to help transition the additional cost of changing your model.
So this is in essence that little sliver that's a part of the foundation program that we're kind of earmarking to our student needs. But if you spread that among the number of students that we need, it's just not anything. I mean, like you look at the English language learners, $18.5 million statewide. That doesn't go very far.
It's really nothing, to be honest with you. And these programs are outside of the existing foundation program. I think that's what most people don't understand. These are not part of the current funding model. These are grant and aid programs that are funded separately through the Department of Education and not through the foundation program itself. So it's important to note that.
So any questions about affordability with Kurt before we move on? Okay. Like,
All right. I know originally it's the chairman said you'd have Alex. Now you don't have Alex. You have me. So sorry. Alex is great, but he's not here. All right. So I want to give you a little bit of framing about the models we're going to be talking about, and then we'll run through those three models that Chairman Garrett previewed for you at the beginning of the conversation. One, just really important, all of these models are illustrations, not recommendations. Our goal here today is to kind of show you what's possible and get your gears turning so we can then get input and feedback for any possible future modeling that we might do. Each model that you're going to see includes a base amount and weights for 5 student groups: low-income students, students with disabilities, English language learners, gifted students, and charter school students. The models vary among each other in the size of their base and in each of the weights, and they vary in their total estimated cost. And I'm going to give you all of those parameters so you can kind of understand what's moving in each model. So each model, again, is illustrating what policy options may be available to you under different revenue scenarios. So we have 3 different revenue growth assumptions. Model 1 assumes that we're adding $112 million a year. Model 2 assumes that we're adding $150 million per year. And then the third model, it includes $200 million in additional funding per year. So as we're kind of moving across these, you'll be able to see what's changing across these models, the impact of that relative to what school districts are currently getting, and hopefully prompt some thinking about what that might mean for school districts across the state. One thing just to note for y'all, all of these models include a weight for gifted student funding. One thing to just flag is that the identification of gifted students across the state is not equal. This is a graph that shows you the identification of gifted students against poverty on the x-axis, and you can kind of see it's all over the place. So there's a lot of inconsistency in how gifted students are identified, which might just be something for y'all to think about as a potential additional set of policy questions to ask as you think about adding a gifted weight, is ensuring that you're thinking about how students are identified for that weight per our previous conversation. So these are the parameters of the 3 models. You don't need to memorize this, but we've got 3 different bases. They move from 7,150 in the first model up to 7,300 in model 3. We have poverty weights that begin at 17%, increase to 21%, and then to 26% in model 3. These are based on direct certification. There was a question earlier about how economic disadvantage might be calculated. There are kind of 2 options right now for identifying low-income students. One is free and reduced price lunch, And the other is direct certification, which is enrollment in other programs that target poverty, like Medicaid or SNAP, those kinds of assistance programs that support other things. Because the U.S. Department of Agriculture has changed the eligibility provisions for free and reduced price lunch and created community eligibility provisions, which essentially enables school districts to stop counting kids once they get past a certain threshold. That's driven a lot of administrative savings in the administration of school lunch programs, but it has caused challenges in counting students who are low income because we just don't have that paperwork anymore. So a lot of states are moving towards direct certification, so looking at other programs to get a more accurate count of how many students qualify for that low income weight. So all of the models that you are going to see here today are based on direct certification numbers within the state of Alabama, not on free and reduced price lunch. We have special education weights in 3 tiers. These 3 tiers are based on disability category. So they range from, in the first set, 10%, 20%, and 80%. The increased cost obviously goes with disabilities that require additional investment in higher cost services. And then they shift up to 15%, 30%, and 100% in the second model, and they stay there for model 3. Each one includes an English learner weight, 10% in the first 2 models and 15% in model 3. We have a gifted weight of 5% across all 3 models that is based on gifted identification, so the percent of students that are identified as gifted within each district. And then a charter school weight of 5% for each student enrolled in a charter school.
So just to clarify on the special needs weight, that's you're categorizing buckets of special needs based upon their severity. Is that?
That's correct. Okay. Yes, sir. And then those cost parameters, which I just talked about, are in the bottom. So this is a nice summary table as you're maybe thinking about this later on to go back and see what the difference is among these models.
And let me just mention one thing too about charter weight. And again, this is something we'll discuss. This is just, but right now we're not providing any funding at all for charter schools. So in this illustrative models, we're at least acknowledging that's something we should discuss. Senator Albritton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make sure I understand a couple of things. One thing particularly, I'm looking at the Model 1 on your aspect. You're talking about 112 million per year. Does that correlate, if I might, going back to Kirk's last slide, I think, where he talked about the different programs that total up to 96 million, about 100 million there, Kirk. Does that 96 million correlate or relate to that 112 million? In other words, are we almost there, or is that completely separate if we choose not to pay for those programs?
Entirely up to you, but if you eliminated all those programs and did this, you would be almost there.
Okay.
Yeah, we could shift. We could phase out or terminate, collapse all those programs into a formula as you see on the slide deck.
So basically, what I think, putting those 2 presentations together, it looks like we may be closer to getting to some kind of a model of structure on this than we maybe think we are. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. We also want to move the needle, and that's something we need to consider to make sure our investment's enough to move the needle.
Precisely.
At the local level.
At least that puts the stretch in perspective as well.
Correct. Senator Smitherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's obvious that someone thought about the need to put that before us about the charter school. Are we talking about public charter, or are we talking about private charter?
Public charter schools. This is all for public schools.
Okay, thank you.
All right. There's a lot of numbers on this. Sorry.
Jen, before you move on, can
Yes,
you
sir.
slide back to that previous slide? There, now that slide. Could you flesh out a little bit the special education weights? What is the total for that bucket there? And you've got it, 10, 20, 80 in Model 1, 15, 30, 100%. Can you talk about that a little bit more, that bracket?
Well, we have 3 tiers that are divided based on the disability.
Right.
So each of those percentages is correlated with a different kind of level of cost. So students who require the least amount of services in order to be successful would be in that first tier. And then it goes up from there. So the largest number of students would be in that first tier because most special education students are at that lower end. And then the higher cost services are at that higher end.
So if I look at this right, in Model 1, you've got 17% for poverty, 10% for English language learners, so that's 27%, and then 5 and 5, so you're 37%. So I would say 63% of the total weight would go to SPED. Is that correct? And then must be split among these three tiers accordingly?
You're trying to make me do math up here with nothing. Maybe, but we need to do a weighted average for the special education weights to weight it by how many students are in each category.
Right.
I would be more than happy to do that. I can't do it right now. I don't have the numbers in front of me that have the number of students in each category.
Okay.
But for purposes of your modeling, you've made some assumptions as to how many students are in those tiers, right?
We didn't make assumptions. We have those data,
Okay.
Thanks to the Department of Education.
Okay. Representative Stubbs?
Well, I think if I might add, just looking at that, I think it's important to note, so the simplest one to look at is English learner weight, 10%. So, and on your next slide, I think you show this individually, but what you're saying there is we would add $715 to the base for each English learner in a respective school district.
That's correct.
And so that specific dollar amount, and then this slide shows the cumulative amount based on the data that you've collected from the State Department of Education.
That's right.
And one question or one point I wanted to make is I think all of the programs that we have, which are the grant programs, which currently are the effort we're making to accommodate all of these specific student-weighted needs. Those grant programs are administered by the state, and schools are receiving those funds, but we don't know that every student is actually receiving those as needed across the state because there's a finite amount of money. What we're talking about here is it allows for the school district to get the money and the local decisions be made with the funds that meet the students' needs, rather than those decisions being made at the state level.
Yes, that's the idea behind the student-weighted funding model.
And one thing that we have discussed as in our working groups and the chairman and I have talked about too, is we all make sure that we don't give the ability for people to game the system. That's important. The transparency and the accountability, that's a key component. But just conceptually, we're trying to basically say systems that have a high level of these various categories of needs, we want to address that because right now we're not. Representative Faulkner?
What determines a gifted student? What is that? How does that define?
Well, that's what. Let's that. Not for today. I mean, that's just the idea is that there may or may not be that weight there, but as she pointed out earlier, there are a lot of systems that we're inconsistent as to how it's defined among systems. So we may or might decide to go down that road. We just put this here as a placeholder, but gifted, I mean, there are definitions. They're inconsistently applied, and they're not even identified statewide necessarily on a consistent basis.
Okay, and I understand that none of this may be the way it is, but I guess I was just trying to figure out what is a gifted student in this proposed model.
These are students who are identified as gifted, reported as gifted students.
And what does that mean? What does that mean, gifted? When you say they're reported as gifted, does that mean
they're identified as academically gifted by their school districts?
Yeah, so basically based on their
the state.
Okay, there's no score, there's no, in other states, how gifted is determined.
Are you saying IQ?
There's a wide range.
Yeah, it's based on IQ,
Okay.
I think so. Yeah.
Maybe if you have to ask the question. Sorry.
All right, carry on.
Seems like a good question to me.
All right, moving on. So this slide kind of points out what the dollar equivalents are for each of these weights in each of the models. So, as was pointed out, because these are percentages based on the base, when you see that 10% weight, you're getting 10% of the base added on top. So you can kind of see, Senator Orr, what the equivalent of the weighted average for the students with disabilities piece would be here. Roughly somewhere in the 33% range of the base, at least in Model 1.
So let me just make sure, let's go back to that. So this first was the current system. So basically, when we look at special education, the 17.4 million, that's what's earmarked, or that's what we assume is part of the foundation program?
That is what's earmarked. That is the high needs fund.
Okay. And so you can see that number is not going to go very far statewide, but under this formula, you said that 17 million becomes 128 million in Model 1, right?
Yes.
And the same English learners right now, we're spending 14 million that we earmark. And really not, as you know, that only recently was allowed for English learners to be tapped into that. That really prior to that was really nothing or very, very little. You're seeing now that number would actually double in Models 1 and 2. Yeah, okay.
Right. And just to be clear, what we're calling the base here is the foundation program plus amounts that are allocated for nurses and technology coordinators. It's a rough estimate, but that currently equates to about $7,270 per student. And I should also note that we are using 2024 data here. We just got the 2025 data, so we need to update and do quality assurance on those models, so we don't have it for you yet. So everything you're going to see today is based on 2024 data. So again, it's illustrative, so hopefully that helps with that. So this is the slide that includes all three models graphed against those percentages of direct certification, so against student poverty there at the bottom. Again, just to orient you to what is on this slide, the ghost circles at the bottom are the current system in fiscal 24, and then you see the red, the black, and then the blue on the top are the three models that we're going to talk through. So you can see a couple of things here. One is that you have a much tighter relationship between how money is going out based on student need, with poverty serving as a proxy for student need in this illustration. And you can see that as you ratchet up those base amounts and those weights, obviously you're investing more funding, you're getting more distance between those current law, those ghost bubbles, and what you're seeing in the models. There are kind of infinite choices in terms of how you mix and match the base and the weights, and so hopefully some of this will help you understand differences in how that impacts what happens in each model. So for each of these, I'm going to run through 4 slides and just want to orient you towards what I'm going to talk about. The first slide, my bubbles moved. The first slide is going to show you a comparison of what districts would get under the model compared to what they are getting currently. So you see that black diagonal line there. Anybody above the line is gaining, anybody below the line is losing. As we noted, the goal is for nobody to lose, so we're looking for all districts to be above that black line. I'll show you a map that gives you a sense of the degree to which districts are gaining. Darker green is going to be more gain. There's some categories of gain in there. We'll talk about funding per student under the model, which will be in color against current law. So those ghost bubbles, that's what you've seen a couple of times already, based on the percentage of low-income students in each district. So that's giving you a sense of how well the model is targeting funding towards student need. And then last will be a summary table breaking down the funding by the base and weight. So a more readable version of the table we just looked at that had all 3 models on it.
And again, I want to make the point that any local money is in addition to whatever you're going to show us. That's apart from this.
That's right. We're only looking at state funding. So the first model, again, this is $112 million per year. So looking at how this model performs against current law, again, everybody above the line is gaining and everyone below the line is losing. In this model, we have one losing district. Linden City is not gaining, so this model doesn't meet that criterion. You can see here what the gain looks like across the state. A lot of green, a little bit of orange, but not a lot of dark green here. So we're not gaining a lot relative to current law in this particular model. Again, you know, looking at this against district poverty, what we see here is that Model 1 is targeting funds better than current law towards student need, but it's not varying a tremendous amount for a lot of districts. You see that those ghost bubbles and the green bubbles are pretty close together for a lot of districts there, so you're not seeing a lot of gain or a lot of differentiation with this model compared to current law. And then again, here's those parameters, which you've seen before, and you can see the number of students in each category who are driving funding for each of the separate weights. All right, Model 2, $150 million a year. This one does meet that commitment. Everybody is gaining in Model 2, so everybody's above that black line. We are seeing an average increase of a little over $1,000 a student in this model, and again, all districts are receiving more. We've seen our map get a little bit greener here, and we've got some of those dark green, which indicate more gain per student. The gains are ranging between about $260 per student to a little under $1,500 per student in Model 2. And then in this one, where we're looking again at how this model is performing against current law based on district poverty, we still see that nice tight correlation with student poverty, and we are seeing a little bit more separation between what districts are getting in current law compared to what they're getting in the model. You see a little bit of daylight between your ghost districts, their ghost bubbles there, and your green bubbles. So remember that what we did in Model 2 is increase the base by $50. So we moved from a $7,150 to a $7,200 base. What that does is benefit all districts, basically the same based on their enrollment. We increased our low income weight. We went from 17% to 21% here. So you see a higher per student amount driving through that particular weight. We increased our special education weights a little bit in each category here, and the English language learner and the gifted weights remain the same in Model 2 compared to Model 1. So what we've done here again is increase the base, increase the low income weight, and increase the special education weights a little bit, and that's what produced that additional gain and kind of pushed that line up, but maintained that relationship to student need. And our last model at $200 million per year. Unsurprisingly, we have everybody above the line here. We see an average gain of just under $1,400 per student in this model. All districts are receiving more. We see a lot more dark green on this map, so we have more districts gaining more under this model compared to the previous two models, with that range of gain being between a little bit over $500 per student to just under $2,000 per student. When we look at this against student poverty and against current law, we see a lot more separation here between what's happening in the model and what's happening in current law. And we retain that nice tight correlation with student poverty. So again, in this one, we jumped the base up to 7,300. So we've been at 7,150, 7,200, and 7,300. And a base increase benefits all districts. We increased that low income weight again to 26%. So we went from 17% in Model 1 to 26% in Model 3. So we're generating a little under $2,000 per student associated with that low income weight. And again, that's based on direct certification numbers. The special education weights are the same in this model compared to Model 2, so you see the same amount there. We increased the English learner weight from 10% to 15% in this model. So we're driving a little bit more money in this model towards English language learners, and then gifted and charter have remained the same throughout. And again, you can mix and match these all different ways. These are just examples so you can kind of see what's happening when you start to change some of these levers. But those are, kind of determining how much goes in the base. Again, that's kind of that first decision. And then which weights and how much are the second set of decisions, along with what are the eligibility criteria for those weights, which is another important set of decisions. Here they are all together. Again, you've seen this slide before, but we've got Model 1 on the bottom, Model 2 in the black, and then Model 3 in the green. Before I change topics to accountability, I want to pause.
Yeah, I want to just say that in the modeling, which behind all this data, we can actually drill down and know what each system's component in each of these models is, so that we have that ability. I also want to say that as we're looking at some of the development of the numbers, the base and things we're doing, we've engaged the expertise of Andy Craig to help us sort through some of this, and he's working very, very hard. So some of you who know him know he understands how we have done and where we want to go. So I want to just give you some comfort in that the numbers, I think, are pretty deep, and I think we've got some good people weighing in. Representative Almond.
I apologize if you've said this already, but what's the average per pupil expenditure nationwide, and then maybe in the Southeast?
I didn't say that today. Nationwide, I believe it is around $14,000 a student. I couldn't tell you in the Southeast off the top of my head. It's lower than $14,000 a student, but I don't know off the top of my head, but I can get back to you. I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Wow.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay, thanks.
All right, we're going to shift gears. We've talked a lot about flexibility, and that that has been laid out as something that is desirable, may be of interest, and maybe a benefit of a student-weighted funding formula. Kind of the other side of that coin is accountability and sort of ensuring that the state is getting out of its investment what it intends in terms of student outcomes. So I want to talk a little bit about experience in a couple of states who've done some funding reform in terms of adding some additional accountability provisions as sort of in exchange for the additional funding investment that they have made. So a couple of just general notes. One, as we've said a few times, student-weighted funding formulas provide districts with more flexibility in terms of how they use their dollars. Unlike a resource-based formula, which kind of provides a spending template that determines staffing decisions and those kinds of things at the local level, you're getting money based on the students that you're serving, and there's a lot of discretion at the local level about where investments are made. During a transition to a student-weighted funding formula, some technical assistance for superintendents, budget officers, and school boards can help them rethink, kind of reshape their mindset around that budget process. We've seen that in other states where that has been of benefit. So just noting that. And then accountability mechanisms on the other side can provide some safeguards for fiscal responsibility and maintaining that focus on student outcomes. So one of the ways that student-weighted funding formulas do this is through that transparency, because the legislature, the state is making a statement about these are the student groups that we want you to focus on through the allocation of dollars. It kind of gives you the basis for that conversation. You got this amount of money for your low-income students. These are the outcomes that you are tracking for low-income students. Let's talk about what's being done there. And it gives you that ability to make that direct connection between how funding is allocated and the outcomes that you are seeing. There are also, beyond sort of transparency, additional mechanisms of accountability that can be established through state policy. You obviously already have a state accountability system, as every state does, but there are some other mechanisms that you can add that some other states have engaged in as they've engaged in these kinds of processes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of examples, but want to think through kind of the continuum of accountability. I talked about transparency already, and that's kind of the less formal option, just sort of having more information, having clearer information about how money is flowing and what your student outcomes are, or kind of the least formal version of that. Some states have engaged, and really some districts have engaged in outcomes-based flexibility, where as districts are demonstrating growth, they get additional flexibility, or for districts that may be underperforming, some of that flexibility is taken back. That's fairly common in state structures and is increasingly common in district structures as well, out to the school level. A consideration there is that those criteria for earned flexibility obviously would need to be established, and that's a separate set of policy decisions that y'all would need to make. There are audits and hearings, so you can empower policymakers to really examine how those new funds are being used, and that may require some new reporting requirements. And I'll talk through an example in Tennessee. They're doing this, they're adding this hearing process that will begin next school year based on the accountability results from the current school year. And then the state ESSA accountability system. So the system that you already have is obviously available to you to kind of target towards these spending decisions that you may be making if you decide to move forward with this process. Amending ESSA plans is a bit of a process, may require federal approval. So, that is a consideration as you think about sort of whether the juice is worth the squeeze there. So we're going to talk a little bit about Maryland and about Tennessee as two examples of states that in the wake of their funding reform processes have enacted some additional accountability mechanisms. The example from Maryland, I would say, is probably a little bit more of a more teeth than the Tennessee system has right now. But what they essentially did is they passed a bill, the Blueprint for Maryland's Future in 2021. It was a very comprehensive bill. It included funding reform, but also a number of other policy changes. It was a very large legislative package. You can see the 5 pillars for that bill right there. But one of the things that it did is established what they call the Accountability and Implementation Board. This is a separate state agency, so it's separate from their Department of Education. But that board was charged with developing a 10-year implementation plan for the blueprint and holding districts accountable for that implementation. As part of that work, they established expert review teams who are panels of experts, educators, folks who are expert in school turnaround, to review district and school performance, including site visits at least once every 5 years. So they're doing a pretty comprehensive academic audit, essentially, of school districts and schools to determine whether they are implementing this bill and these policies well. And then after this year, these expert review teams will be making recommendations to the Accountability and Implementation Board. And the Accountability and Implementation Board has the authority, they are not required to, but they have the authority to withhold up to 25% of new funding. So the amount that was added on top of existing funding through the Blueprint bill, if they are not satisfied with how the district is implementing the bill or their performance. So that's one example. Like I said, that one's a little toothier. Sort of less toothy version is Tennessee's version. The Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement, which was passed in 2022, is now in its 3rd year of implementation, substantially overhauled the state school finance system and added $1 billion in new funding to that system. It also created a financial accountability hearing system. They have not implemented this hearing system yet. They're in rulemaking right now, so some of this may change, full disclosure. But if it moves forward the way that they have proposed it, beginning in the 25-26 school year, their State Board of Education will hold hearings with districts that are operating low-performing schools. Those hearings are supported by data largely drawn from existing reporting requirements. So right now, Tennessee requires every school in every district to have its own school or district improvement plan. And there's a lot of data and reporting requirements that are tied to that. So they're leveraging those plans and those reports to support these hearings. But they are focusing the hearings on seven areas where research shows that these areas are all linked to successful school improvement. So school finance, obviously, climate and culture, staffing, community engagement, attendance, instructional programming, and data-driven decision-making. That was a little bit of a tongue twister this morning. So again, that hearing process will move forward next school year. They have an A to F grading system. Their plan is to start with their F-rated schools, so districts that are operating or charter organizations that are operating F-rated schools will be in kind of that first tranche as they figure out how to actually administer this program. One of the considerations was how many schools would be identified and what was reasonable in terms of the capacity of the state board to hold these hearings if they didn't want hearings to be their full-time job. So there was some consideration given to that as well. But their goal there really is to create that public conversation between the state board and school districts and available obviously to other stakeholders to really talk through how are spending decisions being made and geared towards improvement for particular student groups.
Okay, thank you. That concludes your presentation. So refresh our memory, Tennessee did this in 2022, Mississippi in 2020.
This year.
Okay, this year. Georgia has previously done something or hybrid or no?
No. Georgia has a resource-based formula with some weighted student funding elements, but they haven't done a major finance reform, and I couldn't tell you.
Okay. Senator Singleton.
Yes. I just want to question, maybe I missed it, hopefully I didn't, but when we look at your formulas and your three categories, are pre-K being counted in this? I just been hearing the terminology K through 12, or are we considered pre-K in this also?
This includes K through 12, not pre-K currently.
Not pre-K. I love the system numbers on pre-K.
So we'll entertain questions, but I hope that this presentation has helped you see, number one, visually kind of where we are and why we're going down this road. Again, 45 states have moved ahead. This is the way the world is going. We haven't changed our model in 30 plus years, but we're not addressing the individual student needs of these systems. And it just stands to reason that if we continue to fund the way we're funded, we're going to continue to see similar results that we've seen in the past. So that's why we're looking at it. You can kind of see what these models do and how they provide for student needs and how significant they could be depending on the dollar investment you make. Also, I think you can see that we've set aside funding for transformative educational situations. Got a healthy balance in our education opportunity reserve fund that could certainly be utilized as we move forward. So hopefully that there is better saying. So, Chairman, yeah.
Okay, closing comments, if I don't see any questions. The other thing I would say, in addition to what Chairman Garrett said, the three models that you saw are not chairman endorsed models by any stretch of the imagination. I've made some notes here that I'd like to see in future models and see what they look like. But if you have particular interest that are relevant to your constituency, your district, your area of the state, please feel free to share those with Chairman Garrett or myself, or we can get you a model run on what you'd like to see. If you want to play with the numbers, we're here to accommodate as we work through this. I believe we'll be scheduled for another meeting, Chairman Garrett, in December.
That's right.
Second week in December.
And what would be our expectations for that meeting? We'll have some more development on a base number. What else? I mean, what can you tell us?
So, Mr. Chairman, Mark Dixon with A+ Education Partnership. So in terms of any additional shifts in the model that y'all would like to see and any feedback that the chairman have can be updated and provided. But also, as a committee, y'all are committed to writing a report and looking at potential draft language of what you might like to see in that report and any direction that you would like to go. And so that's another thing to be considered in that meeting as well.
But we'll be seeing some more granular detail on the base the next meeting, right?
Yes, it included as a part of that conversation with the models.
Okay. I'm sure there'll be conversations back home with your superintendents and school board members and members of the Ed family here in Montgomery and others. So as you go forward, we certainly expect input and direction and concerns all to be raised. So don't feel inhibited to do such. We're all in this together, in this process of discovering or vetting whether we want to continue looking at the student weighted funding formula. Senator Smitherman, I see your hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we look to our meeting in December, do we have any, I know we said second week, but do we have any kind of feel when we say second week, is it going to be after the 7th of December?
Do you know if it's going to be after the December 7th?
Yes, it'll be the second week in December, I believe, is what we're looking at.
All right.
First week's a busy week for a lot of members. I believe we'll be looking at that week of the 9th through the 13th.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Singleton.
I would like to thank you both chairmen for having this real discussion about education and equity in education. For the first time since I've been here in 20 years, this is the best refreshing conversation that I've had about education and being able to say no child will be left behind if we choose to go down these roads. We're finally going to get an opportunity to make sure that all of our kids are getting the best that we can offer them in the state of Alabama. Thank y'all very much.
Senator Gavan. Thank you, Senator Singleton.
Mr. Chairman.
When Singleton and I are on the same page, can we be stopped?
Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I likewise echo the sentiments of Senator Singleton. I much appreciate the leadership of both of the chairmen on this. The inclusivity, I think there were those that somewhat thought at the very forefront that there might have already been somewhat a preordained or preconceived sort of idea as to exactly what direction we would go, but it's very admirable to both of you and that you've been very objective in this process to try to look at any and everything in this. So thank you so much.
Thank you. We've had a lot of conference calls and a lot of meetings, a lot more than I care to comment about. We've been blessed to have A+ working with us on this process and guiding it. And of course, the bellwether consultants to be the out-of-town experts on things. But now we're opening it up, and we certainly expect to hear from the team across the street in Governor Ivey's office a little bit more. They've been involved behind the scenes, but now that we do have these models that we've just gone through, we can get down to a more granular detail. And then, of course, the Ed family and your superintendents and board members back home. Some of them will have some input and some things they want to share with you. So it's a collaborative process that, so far so good, but we still have a long way to go. So thank you for the comments. That being said, we are adjourned, and thank you for your attendance. We had a great attendance today. Thank you.
Appreciate your